Picture this. You're 13 years old, and tomorrow you'll marry someone you've never met. Your parents arranged it last winter over a cup of ale and a handshake. There's no romance, no choice, and certainly no escape. This was reality for millions of people in medieval Europe, where marriage was business, survival, and politics, all rolled into one cold, calculated deal. And imagine waking up on your wedding day, knowing that your entire future has been decided by people who care more about land and money than your happiness. You don't know if your future husband is kind or cruel, young or old, rich or poor. All you know is that after today, your life will never be the same. This wasn't some rare occurrence or punishment. This was just how things worked for almost everyone living between the years 1000 and 1500. In those days, marriage had nothing to do with love. It was about making deals, gaining power, and ensuring families could survive in a world full of disease, war, and uncertainty. Children were married off like pieces on a chessboard, moved around to create the best possible outcome for their parents and relatives. The idea of marrying someone because you loved them was so unusual that most people would have thought you were crazy for even suggesting it. Today, we're going to explore what marriage was really like during the Middle Ages. We'll discover how families made these arrangements, what happened during the ceremonies, and why the system worked the way it did for hundreds of years. It's a story that might seem shocking by today's standards, but it reveals how people adapted to survive in a world very different from our own. The business of betrothal. In medieval society, marriage began not with dating or courtship, but with business meetings between families. Parents would sit around wooden tables in dimly lit rooms, discussing their children like they were discussing livestock or pieces of property. These conversations usually happened when the children were still very young, sometimes as young as 7 years old, and occasionally even younger than that. The process always started with money and property. Families needed to figure out what each side would bring to the marriage. The bride's family would offer something called a dowry, which was like a payment that came with their daughter. This could include land, animals, household goods, or actual coins. For a poor farming family, a dowry might be 3 cows, a small plot of land, and some chickens. For wealthy merchant families, it could be hundreds of silver coins, a house in town, and the rights to operate certain businesses. The amounts involved were staggering when you think about it in modern terms. A modest dowry for a middle-class family in 12th century England might include 20 acres of farmland, which would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars today. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II of England, she brought with her the entire Duchy of Aquitaine, which was about 1/3 of what we now call France. That single marriage deal involved more wealth and territory than most countries possess today. Records kept by monks and church officials show us just how common these arranged marriages were. In the 1200s, roughly 3 out of every 4 noble marriages were arranged before the bride turned 14. Even among regular farming families, about half of all marriages were arranged by parents rather than chosen by the young people themselves. This wasn't because parents were cruel or didn't care about their children's happiness. It was because survival was so difficult that families couldn't afford to let emotions guide such important decisions. Actual betrothal ceremony was surprisingly formal and legal. Contracts were written out in Latin by educated scribes, usually monks or church officials who could read and write. These documents had to be witnessed by at least 6 adults from both families, and they were sealed with wax impressions from family rings or official seals. Breaking one of these agreements wasn't just disappointing, it could result in financial penalties that would ruin a family for years. Penalties for breaking a betrothal contract were severe enough to bankrupt most families. If you agreed to marry someone and then changed your mind, your family might have to pay the equivalent of 3 years' worth of income to the other family. For a farming family, this could mean losing their land, their animals, and their home. For a merchant family, it could mean losing their business and their position in society. This is why parents chose very carefully, but once they made their choice, they expected complete obedience from their children. These arrangements weren't just about the immediate families involved. Extended relatives, friends, and even entire communities had interests in seeing these marriages succeed. A successful marriage could mean better trade relationships, stronger protection against enemies, and access to new resources. A failed marriage could mean isolation, economic hardship, and vulnerability to attack. In a world where survival depended on cooperation and mutual support, Marriage was far too important to be left to the whims of young people who might choose based on temporary feelings rather than long-term practical considerations. The negotiation process could take months or even years to complete. Families would meet multiple times, often bringing in neutral parties to help work out the details. They would discuss not just the dowry and bride price, but also where the couple would live, what role each family would play in their lives, and how property would be divided if anything went wrong. These weren't simple handshake deals. They were complex legal arrangements that affected multiple generations and could influence the prosperity of entire communities for decades to come. The role of the church. Once families had worked out their business arrangements, they faced another powerful force that controlled medieval marriage: the Catholic Church. The church didn't just perform wedding ceremonies. It created and enforced the rules that governed every aspect of married life. These rules were written down in something called canon law, which was developed over hundreds of years by church officials who spent their lives thinking about how marriage should work. The Church established some basic requirements that every marriage had to meet. Both the bride and groom had to say yes out loud during the ceremony, though as we'll see, this didn't mean they had much real choice in the matter. The church also set minimum ages for marriage: 12 years old for girls and 14 years old for boys. However, these age limits were often ignored, especially when noble families saw a chance to make a profitable alliance. Rich and powerful families regularly married off children who were even younger, then waited until they reached the official age before allowing them to live together as husband and wife. One of the most complicated rules the church created involved family relationships. According to church law, you couldn't marry anyone who was related to you within 7 degrees of kinship. This sounds simple, but in practice it was incredibly complex. 7 degrees meant you had to trace back through your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents and make sure you didn't share any ancestors with your intended spouse. In small medieval villages where the same families had lived for generations, finding someone you could legally marry became a real challenge. The Church employed special experts whose job was to trace these family connections. These genealogical investigators would spend weeks researching family trees, interviewing elderly villagers, and examining church records to determine whether a proposed marriage was legal. Often they would discover that couples who thought they were unrelated actually shared a common ancestor from several generations back. When this happened, the families would have to pay special fees to the church to get permission to proceed with the marriage anyway. These fees were substantial and provided a major source of income for the church. A typical wedding ceremony cost about 2 weeks' wages for a skilled craftsman like a blacksmith or carpenter. Special permissions cost even more. If you wanted to marry during Lent, when marriages were normally forbidden, you might pay the equivalent of a month's salary. If you wanted to marry someone from another country, or someone who had been married before, or someone who was distantly related to you, each situation required additional payments that could bankrupt modest families. Church records from Canterbury Cathedral in England show us exactly how often these complications arose. Between the years 1180 and 1220, about 1 out of every 8 marriage requests was initially denied because of kinship concerns. Most couples eventually got permission to marry, but only after paying substantial fees to the church. This system meant that wealthy families could usually find a way around the rules, while poor families might be forced to remain unmarried or risk excommunication by marrying without church approval. The Church also controlled the timing of marriages throughout the year. Weddings were forbidden during Advent, the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas. They were forbidden during Lent, the 6 weeks before Easter. They were forbidden during certain saints' days and holy periods. When you added up all these restrictions, there were only about 4 months out of the year when ordinary people could get married. This created intense competition for available dates, which drove up the costs of ceremonies and made it even harder for poor families to afford weddings. Despite all these rules and restrictions, the church claimed that marriage was a holy sacrament blessed by God. Church officials taught that once 2 people were properly married, their union was permanent and sacred. Divorce was absolutely forbidden. The only way to end a marriage was through annulment, which meant proving that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. This might happen if the couple had been too young when they married, or if one of them had been forced to participate against their will, or if they were discovered to be too closely related. However, getting an annulment required extensive legal proceedings, substantial payments to church officials, and testimony from multiple witnesses. For most people, it was simply impossible. The Church's power over marriage extended beyond just the ceremony itself. Church officials decided what married couples could and couldn't do in their private lives. They established rules about when husbands and wives could be physically intimate, what positions were acceptable, and what the purpose of intimacy should be. According to church teaching, married couples should only be intimate for the purpose of having children. Any other reason was considered sinful. The church even created calendars showing which days of the week and which times of the year intimacy was forbidden. When you added up all the prohibited days, Sundays, Thursdays, Fridays, holy days, Lent, Advent, and various other restrictions, married couples were left with only about 1 day per week when intimacy was considered acceptable. Picture this. You're 13 years old, and tomorrow you'll marry someone you've never met. Your parents arranged it last winter over a cup of ale and a handshake. There's no romance, no choice, and certainly no escape. This was reality for millions of people in medieval Europe, where marriage was business, survival, and politics all rolled into one cold, calculated deal. Imagine waking up on your wedding day knowing that your entire future has been decided by people who care more about land and money than your happiness. You don't know if your future husband is kind or cruel, young or old, rich or poor. All you know is that after today, your life will never be the same. This wasn't some rare occurrence or punishment. This was just how things worked for almost everyone living between the years 1000 and 1500. In those days, marriage had nothing to do with love. It was about making deals, gaining power, and ensuring families could survive in a world full of disease, war, and uncertainty. Children were married off like pieces on a chessboard, moved around to create the best possible outcome for their parents and relatives. The idea of marrying someone because you loved them was so unusual that most people would have thought you were crazy for even suggesting it. Today, we're going to explore what marriage was really like during the Middle Ages. We'll discover how families made these arrangements, what happened during the ceremonies, and why the system worked the way it did for hundreds of years. It's a story that might seem shocking by today's standards, but it reveals how people adapted to survive in a world very different from our own,